this short video, we will be looking at two chapters, Chapter 4.2, Percent of a Number, and 4.3, Estimating with Percent Mental Math. Now, you'll recall from your previous chapters, where we dealt with a little bit of a percentage, is if you wanted to change a number to a percent, then all you have to do is simply multiply that number by 100. So here I have an example. If you're given the number 1/4 and we wanted to change that to a percentage, then all we have to do is take 1/4 and multiply that by 100. And recall that when we're multiplying a fraction by another number, then you multiply the numerator by the numerator, denominator by the denominator. So in this case, we have 100 times 1 divided by 4, which gives you then 25. So therefore we would have ourselves 25%. Similarly, if we were given the number 4 and we wanted to change that into a percentage, then all we have to do is multiply by 100 again, and therefore we would get 400%. Simple as that. Now, when we're talking about percent of a number, it simply means multiply. Well, at least that's the operation that you would need to use. So if we were asked to find 50% of the number 4, then all we have to do is take 50% and convert that into a decimal, which therefore would be 0.5, and multiply that by 4, and therefore we would get the value of 2. So in other words, 2 is 50% of 4. We take another example, 25% of 1/4. Well, 25% of 1/4, we would take 25% and change that into a decimal, which would be 0.25. Multiply that by 1/4. Alternatively, you can think of it as a quarter, which is the same as 0.25, times 0.25. Therefore, we would get 1/16. Now here's another example using a pizza. Now hopefully this example doesn't make you hungry and forget about how to do the math calculations. But anyway, now would be a good time to take a pause and try calculating these values for yourself before checking the answers. Okay, now just like the previous question on the previous slide, to calculate 50% of 8 slices, you would simply use the 50%, convert that into a decimal format, which is 0.5, then multiply by the 8 slices. So therefore 50% of 8 slices is 4 slices. For 25% of 8 slices, you would take 25%, convert that to 0.25 as a decimal, multiply that by the 8 slices, it would work out to be 2 slices. For 12.5% of 8 slices, 12.5% as a decimal would be 0.125, multiply that by 8, and it would work out to be 1 slice. Simple as that. Now, if that's the case, if we followed the same format of how to make these calculations, then what would 10% of 8 slices be? Take a pause and try this out for yourself before checking the answer. Okay, so following the same format, 10% would be 0.1. Multiply that by 8 slices, and therefore it would be 0.8 slices. Now what the heck does that mean? 0.8 slices would really mean then it's 80% of 1 slice of pizza. So it's not even a full slice, it's only a partial piece of the pizza. Okay, so now we're on to Chapter 4.3, where we're going to learn to use a little mental math to help us estimate some percentages. Now this can be a useful thing to be able to do because you're not always going to have a calculator with you, and often it's not necessary to have an exact value anyway. For instance, if you're at the store and you wanted to just estimate how much tax you might need to pay on an item, for example, then it's not necessary for you to pull out a calculator and calculate an exact value. You might just want to have a ballpark figure of how much it's going to cost you in tax. So learning to do a little mental math would be helpful in that case. So here's an example to start off. If we wanted to estimate 10% of 50, how would we do that? Well, 10% is always pretty easy to calculate because all we have to do is think like this. If we took 10% and in our heads we thought 10% is 0.1 and we multiplied that by 50, it will work out to be 5. Now, really simply though, instead of having to do that calculation out by hand or using a calculator, all you really have to do is think like this. If you look at the number 50, while 10% was 5, all we had to do was move the decimal from the end here over one spot, and we got ourselves 5. So 10% of any number is usually really easy to figure out because all you have to do is move the decimal to the left by one spot. So knowing that, then, how would we use that fact to help us figure out 20% of 50? Well, of course, if you've already gotten 10% of 50, then simply 20% would be double that amount. So, very simply then, 20% of 50 must be then double the 5, which is 10. So then how do we go and figure out what 15% of 50 is? Well, if we know that 10% was 5 and 20% was 10, then 15% must be right in the middle. So therefore, 15% of 50 would work out to be 7.5. So this is just one way of doing a little mental math to help us make these calculations in our head. Okay. So if the numbers weren't so nice, for example, 15% of 56, well, how would we use a strategy in our head to be able to figure this out? So one way to do this is to take the 56 and round that upwards, because we really don't want necessarily an exact value anyway. So instead of using 56, let's say it's 60. Okay. So if we took 10% in our head of 60, that would then be 6. We want 5% more, which therefore must be half of 6. So we'll add half of 6, which is 3. And therefore when you add 6 plus 3 in your head, it would be 9. So 15% of 60 would be 9. Simple as that. So using this similar kind of strategy, see if you are able to calculate 30% of $90. Take a pause and try this for yourself. Okay, so 30%. To find out 30% of $90, simply take 10% first. So 10% of 90, well, you move the decimal over 1, so therefore it's 9. So that would be $9 is 10%. So if we want 30%, then all we have to do is take that 9 and multiply by 3, and therefore 30% of $90 is $27. Now once again, this is not the only way you can use to estimate these values, but this is just one strategy to use to help you estimate percentages without using a calculator. So that concludes this video. Hopefully you've been able to do a little mental math and learn how to calculate percentages of numbers.